I am Heidi Bryan, the chair of FUEL, the ERG. It stands for Fully Utilizing Employees Without Labeling. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to introduce Ken Rogers. Ken is our Disability Programs Coordinator, and he works in the Affirmative Action Office. He has a great understanding and great appreciation for what it takes to inform and help implement the Governor's Executive Order 1414. Ken has been an advocate for the topic and continues to work towards helping to implement this executive order. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ken Rogers.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here, giving up your lunch to come and listen to a little discussion about what Executive Order 1414 is all about. Hopefully by the end of my presentation, you'll have a little better understanding of how we got here and why we're here and what it's all about. I will be opening it up for questions afterwards. So if you have any questions, just jot them down, keep them in mind, and you'll have an opportunity to ask them as we go through the presentation at the end. Okay. How many, show of hands, or let's do it verbally so I know. How many people have heard of Executive Order 1414? Say yes. Yes. That's good. That's good. That's impressive. How many people know what it is? Say yes. Okay, fewer. So good. You're in the right place. So what I don't have a PowerPoint. I thought I would spare you all from having a PowerPoint, and I'm just going to go through some notes and give you some background, tell you what Executive Order 1414 is all about, how we got here, why we're doing this, a little background of the history, and a little national perspective, a little local perspective, and then we'll go from there. Questions at the end. Okay. So the other really key thing that I'll share is why now? Why is now the time that Executive Order 1414 is really important? And that has some bearing to a lot of things going on around us. And I'll get more into that as well. So, Executive Order 1414. In August of last year, Governor Dayton signed Executive Order 14-14 into place. The executive order itself actually starts out referencing some historical data about individuals with disabilities in state government. Executive Order 1414 is the executive order which will establish the state of Minnesota as a model employer for individuals with disabilities. But to help us understand why this is really relevant and why now, I'm going to talk a little bit about some federal efforts that are going on around employment and persons with disabilities, especially in the federal government sector. Executive Order 13548 is a federal executive order signed by President Obama that required that within the federal government they would hire 100,000 individuals with disabilities within a set period of time. I think they gave them five years to meet that goal. We're 2 years into that plan, and they're making significant headways with the actual number of individuals being hired in federal positions across the federal government. And you can imagine such an endeavor required an infrastructure to be established first. So it took a while to get the infrastructure in place, get all the details figured out, how this was going to work, and that's all in place now. So that's fully implemented, and they're hiring individuals with disabilities, qualified individuals with disabilities, to do those jobs within the federal sector now. So that's first and primary important to keep in mind. The federal government and what they do oftentimes sets the stage for what we do as state agencies as well. The other national piece that's really important is the National Governors Association. That is an association made up of all the state's governors that come together and look at policies, set established priorities for the year. And in 2 years ago, the National Governors Association developed a report. It was called A Better Bottom Line, Employing People with Disabilities. This report focused on best practices of hiring individuals with disabilities within state government. They looked at programs across the states. They were looking specifically for, in their research, they were looking for individual states that had particular model programs in place. And when they did the research, they found only 10 states have something, some type of initiative in place to hire individuals with disabilities within state government, just 10 states. But actually only 2 states had actual executive orders requiring some action on state agencies' behalves. The 10 states that had some type of initiative going on were California, of course, Illinois, Maine, Utah, Kansas, Massachusetts, Virginia, Washington, the state, Alaska, and New Mexico. These all had some type of initiative going on within the state to look at the employment of individuals with disabilities within state government. The actual result of that report produced by the National Governors Association was really a call to action to all states and to all governors specifically to do something to implement some type of plan around employing individuals with disabilities within state government. One of the other national events going on at about the same time is the Department of Labor's expansion of Section 503 of the Rehab Act of 1973, which now requires all contractors that receive federal funds to do any type of government work, if a contractor receives any type of federal funding, they are now required to have a 7% hiring threshold for individuals with disabilities as a floor. So they're now required, if they receive funding from the federal government for any projects, they're required to hire at that 7% level for individuals with disabilities. This is huge, absolutely huge. It's never been done before, and it seems to be working well right now. It's still early in the process. This was only approved officially less than a year ago. And they had some kinks to work out, but it seems to be working out just fine. There was a court case, an association of contractors that pushed back and filed a lawsuit saying that they shouldn't be allowed to be able to do this and dictate which individuals they hire for their business, and they lost. The courts ruled that this can go forward and should go forward, and it is going forward. Another national movement was that in October of 2013, the Employer Assistance and Resource Network, which is EARN, that's a Department of Labor agency, they released a report called On States as a Model Employer for people with disabilities. So they're also looking at best practices for states to use in their hiring practices of individuals with disabilities within the workforce. It was a comprehensive review of all policies, practices, and strategies used within various states across the U.S. One of the other really big events that helped set the stage for Executive Order 1414 was something called the Olmstead Plan, or the Olmstead Decision. Anybody know about that? If you know about that, say yes. Yes. Okay. For those that don't, I'll just give you a little brief of what the Olmstead Decision was all about. Back in, basically, the Olmstead Decision was a U.S. Supreme Court ruling that held, let me get my notes here. that it held that Title II of the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, requires states to provide services to individuals with disabilities in community settings rather than in institutions, and in the most integrated settings appropriate to their needs. Okay, it sounds like it's kind of a no-brainer, but up until that decision, that wasn't the law of the land. And with this U.S. Supreme Court decision, it now clearly, squarely puts Title II at the head of this requirement. It allows this to fall under Title II of the ADA now. The original Olmsted case was a case out of Georgia. It was two women who were institutionalized. They were women that happened to have developmental disabilities. They were institutionalized in Georgia for a treatment period. At the end of their treatment, they were not released. And they were not released because in the state of Georgia, they didn't have a system set up so that they could receive services within the community. So they were left in the institution against their wanting to be there. They finally filed a lawsuit wanting to get out of the institution because they had completed their treatment plan and program, and they weren't being allowed to leave the institution. So this went all the way up through the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court then ruled that you can't hold individuals with disabilities in institutions just because you don't have integrated settings. You must make your settings integrated and provide those services in the community as appropriate to those individuals. So again, this was a monumental decision that changed the way states do business. That decision also required, it mandated that all states develop an Olmsted plan. Every state was required as part of that U.S. Supreme Court decision to establish an Olmsted plan. This was in 1999. Okay. So Minnesota's Olmsted plan comes into play here. A full 14 years after that Supreme Court mandate that all states have an Olmsted plan, Minnesota's now just getting to our plan. And what really brought this to light was, again, another lawsuit. This one was with the Jensens versus the Department of Human Services. And it was about their treatment in what was used to be called MnDOT, the Minnesota Extended Treatment Organization. It's run and staffed by the Department of Human Services, so that's why Human Services was named in the suit. There were all kinds of issues in that lawsuit. Some of them were the use of restraints, the use of seclusion, all types of human right violations, alleged human right violations. The courts ruled in favor of the Jensens and fined the Department of Human Services a big fine and ordered them to clean up the program and make some changes. Also a part of that decision was that the state of Minnesota must develop an Olmsted plan. So in 2011, as part of that Jensen response, as part of that remedy, Minnesota was mandated to create an Olmsted plan as part of the provision. So some really important distinctions about this particular provision for Minnesota out of this treatment facility decision was that, number one, it had to be overseen by a federal judge, and the federal judge to oversee our plan is Judge Donovan Frank. For those of you that know the court system, Donovan Frank is a well-known judge that has a favorable view from the disability community. He's served on a lot of cases involving individuals with disabilities. So that was a huge piece of it. They also were ordered to have a court-ordered monitor assigned to the program to ensure that the Olmsted Plan was developed, not only developed, but implemented, and that it wasn't just a plan that would be a nice report that would sit on some shelf somewhere, but that it actually got implemented. So in 2012, the Olmsted Committee was established by the governor, and it included individuals with disabilities, family members and providers of individuals with disabilities, community advocates, and senior decision makers from the Department of Human Services. Their charge was, as a committee, was to make recommendations to the commissioner of DHS, and that recommendation was to establish a sub-cabinet, to establish a plan and develop a whole organized plan called the Minnesota Olmsted Plan. In January of 2013, Governor Dayton signed an executive order to do just that. So an Olmsted Plan sub-cabinet was developed. It was chaired by the Lieutenant Governor, and it included 10 executive order agencies, the commissioners of 10 executive order agencies. Now, it could be the commissioner or a commissioner's designee, but for the most part, the commissioners were involved pretty heavily. The 10 agencies involved in that Olmsted sub-cabinet were Department of Human Services, Minnesota Finance Housing Agency, Department of Employment and Economic Development, a Department of Transportation, the Department of Corrections, Department of Health, the Department of Human Rights, and the Department of Education. So their charge was to come together to help develop the Olmsted Plan. And basically that's how and what we will do to adhere to this new ruling from the federal courts. There were also some agencies that were named in the executive order that were to serve as ex officio members. So the Minnesota Office of Ombudsman for Mental Health and Disabilities was named specifically, as was the Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities. So they served as ex officio members of that sub-cabinet as well. They developed a plan. It was sent out for public comment and submitted to the courts. The plan was provisionally accepted right away, but subsequently has been rejected by Judge Frank and the courts, and the state was told that there aren't enough specific objective measurements in the plan, and that it needed a little bit more work. So it was sent back to the Olmsted Committee, or now we have an office, the Olmsted Implementation Office, with an executive director that is charged with implementing Olmsted Plan for Minnesota. So it was sent back to them for some revisions, and they've been working with the state agencies to develop those revisions. Those have been resubmitted, and we're now awaiting word to find out if the plan will be approved by Judge Frank. Basically, Minnesota Olmsted Plan can be thought of what needs to happen and when will it happen. That's the basic premise of our plan. So one other thing that was happening locally that helped kind of set the stage for Executive Order 1414 was work done by the Governor's Workforce Development Council. That council, GWDC, released a report in 2012 called All Hands on Deck. They developed that report over the period of a year and a half previous to its release, and looked at employment of persons with disabilities within the state, and focused on 3 specific items: job qualifications and job postings, research and identification of best practices from other employers around the state with regards to hiring of people with disabilities, and development of components of a model recruitment and retention plan. So that report had some very strong recommendations. The GWDC worked in partnership with the Humphrey School of Public Policy in developing their recommendations, and those recommendations were in the final report. Humphrey took an in-depth look at over 600 actual, active, current job postings that were posted for jobs that were open across the state at that given time. They looked at 600 job postings and position descriptions. And they were looking for potential discriminatory language that was just being used summarily in those announcements. It was thought that such discriminatory language, just by the nature of them being in a job posting, would eliminate people with disabilities from applying for some of those jobs, or to even be deemed ineligible to apply for such a job if that language existed in that position description or that job announcement. What they discovered was that over 70% of those 600 job postings included discriminatory language. Some of that discriminatory language was things like, must have a valid driver's license. That was used a lot, even for positions that don't require the employee to drive. Must have excellent oral communication skills. Oral communication skills. Must read and write fluent English. Upon further analysis of job tasks, it was discovered that language was used that did not clearly match the duties. Like having a valid driver's license was used to indicate that someone needed to travel from point A to point B. But as you know, there's many ways to get from point A to point B. I have no problem getting from point A to point B, and I don't drive. So that job requirement of having a driver's license was identified as a discriminatory language in that posting. Regarding oral communication skills, the analysis showed was what it really meant was the individual needed to have good communication skills. They didn't necessarily have to use their mouth or speak orally, because we have people that don't do that and can communicate quite effectively. So those types of identified phrases were riddled in our job description statewide. I'm not talking about any particular job. So they just looked at it holistically. And as a practice, our position descriptions and announcements contained lots of language such as those examples. So consequently, many individuals with disabilities never even had a chance to get a foot in the door to apply for a state job because of that disqualifying language up front. The outcome of All Hands on Deck, which was the GWDC's report, was a call to action, urging the governor to issue an executive order to address moving the state of Minnesota to become a model employer for persons with disabilities, as indicated by the National Governors Association's call to action as well. One other piece that's really important to keep in mind too is at the same time we're hearing from the demographer's office, from the state demographer's office, news about the ever-shrinking workforce within state agencies. How many of you already feel the shrinking workforce in your own unit or division? I mean, we're all feeling it. It's shrinking. People are leaving and not being replaced at that same rate. Did you know, regarding the retirement and our rule of 90 within the state, it's estimated that today a full 45 to 55% of our current employees could walk out the door today meeting rule of 90. 45 to 55% could walk out today meeting their retirement requirement. What would that do to our agency? What would that do to our state? It would cripple us pretty much. And as you know, our state isn't really quick at replacing positions. It takes time. We're a bureaucracy, so it takes time. The other thing that the demographer has been telling us for a few years now is that the job pool for replacements of those jobs is shrinking. So financially, as our population ages and more people move from the status of being a worker, a contributor to taxes, they're moving to the roles of people needing services that we provide. So we're going to be in trouble if we don't do something about what's ahead for us. That's a call to action from the demographer's office that continues to be made today. One of the other items identified in the GWDC report was the shrinking number of persons with individuals that are in the workforce, actually. And how do we know how many people with disabilities are in the workforce? Does anybody know that? Anybody want to take a guess? It is self-report. It's illegal for us to require people to identify themselves as a person with a disability, but it's a voluntary self-reporting practice. But for the state of Minnesota, the practice has been you get an opportunity to divulge that information or volunteer that information when you onboard as an employee for the first time. When you set up your profile in Semaphore, there's an option to answer the question, are you an individual that identifies as having a disability? Yes, no, or decline to answer. You had one shot to do that, and that was when you were hired. Other than that, there really was no clear mechanism for changing that status. So our self-reporting number of individuals with disabilities is a guess at best, and probably not very accurate. Even such that it's not as accurate, we had 10 years ago within state government, a total self-reported number of 10.2% individuals in the workforce for state government were individuals identified as people with disabilities. 10.2%. That was 10 years ago. Anybody know what the percentage is today? It's 3.2. 3.2. Now, we're doing a couple of things to try to update our numbers. And those of you that might have remembered, probably about 9 months ago, maybe 10 months ago, there was notices sent out all across state agencies asking people to take a look at Semaphore, because Semaphore was changed so that anybody can go into Semaphore now and change their status voluntarily at any time. It doesn't have to be done only when you onboard as a new employee. So now we wanted to get a more accurate count. So we asked people to take a look at that and look at that status that's marked. Are they an individual that identifies with a disability? We got a slight bump for the Department of Transportation. We went from 3.2 basically to 4.1. So we got a little bit of a bump. But there's still a little bit of hesitation for people to identify as individuals with disabilities. So we have some work to do around changing our culture around disability. And that's partly why FUEL exists as an employee resource group, to help educate and teach people and bring awareness to the fact that we have a culture here that's accepting of individuals with disabilities. And we have some work to do. So Minnesota's Executive Order 1414. On August 4th of 2014, Governor Dayton signed this order, which states basically that all state agencies must attain a level of individuals with disabilities at a 7% rate by 2018. That's in all job classifications across the board. So and I told you about our numbers in 2004, so 10, let's see. There are some other items in the executive order as well regarding hiring and selection. There's provisions to look at the supported worker program. And supported workers are individuals with significant disabilities that might have, as part of their support system, a worker that helps them do their job, helps them, supports them in doing their actual hired job. That's a program that has existed within our state for a long time. It's a part of the vocational rehabilitation program. And the executive order mentions that that needs to be looked at and fired up. There's also something called the 700-hour program, which basically is on the books today but has dropped off. We used to have almost 80 employees that were a part of the 700-hour program. And basically what that is that an individual with a disability, and again, at earlier years we were talking about individuals with significant disabilities, could be hired into a position based on their disability for 700 hours as sort of a trial period. You might think of it as an apprenticeship almost, but this would allow individuals to be brought in on a temporary basis for 700 hours to allow them to figure out if there's a way that we can work to make that job work for that individual. The governor wants that program reinvigorated and looked at. Statewide reasonable accommodation policy, that was also listed in Executive Order 14, that the state have a statewide reasonable accommodation policy, which would require each agency to have their own reasonable accommodation policy. And we just finished, probably about 6 months ago, we finished our own Department of Transportation reasonable accommodation policy, and you can find that on the iHub. It also requires in Executive Order 14 that training to all employees, and especially managers and supervisors, about the Executive Order 14. One other thing that it does mention is that it sets up a pilot project to look at pooling of resources to provide reasonable accommodations. So instead of right now, if you have an employee in your unit that needs a reasonable accommodation, that comes out of your department budget. The pilot project is to be set up that will look at pooling resources so that all the reasonable accommodation costs would come out of a centralized fund. It's very interesting though, because the research shows that one of the reasons why fewer people have been involved in employment for various companies across the state is because employers believe reasonable accommodations are too costly. The average cost of a reasonable accommodation is less than $100. Less than $100. So there's a lot of myths that are guiding our past practices in employing people with individuals with disabilities. So Executive Order 1414 was crafted to try to eliminate and dispel some of those myths. But we're looking at the centralized pool of money, resources for that, to see if that might be a way we might move. It also requires that MMB, Minnesota Management and Budget, be the focus point that will provide a toolbox for each agency to develop best practices and to help guide us along in developing our action plan to implement Executive Order 1414. Right now, the toolbox was supposed to be unveiled in December, and it's got a slight delay. So we're still waiting for some guidance, but it's coming, and they're working hard to establish that. That's still, absent that guidance, it does not remove the requirement that agencies move forward with Executive Order 1414. It also mentions in the executive order that we have a focus in our state of accessibility of electronic materials and materials created, developed, or purchased by state agencies. And the requirement refers back to our state statute that requires accessibility guidelines used in those documentation, development, procurement, or creation. In the executive order, MMB and the State Director for Equal Opportunity and Diversity is the person that's actually tasked to help the state agencies implement this executive order. Now, they're only there to help us implement, so we still have the requirement to implement that order ourselves. So each agency has that task. So again, each agency is responsible for implementing procedures and practices that are outlined in the executive order itself. So what now? We have several things that are going on within the state. There are several work groups that are currently working to develop model practices for looking at hiring and retention policies, practices, the way we do currently do our business in that area. We have interagency work groups that are focused and working on making recommendations currently. MnDOT is part of those workforce groups. There's also what's helping spur this movement on is in June, I believe. It was originally going to be in May, but now it's been moved to June. There will be the unveiling of a new online application process for all state government jobs. The work groups are currently looking at that software and the process that we use in advertising, getting applicants, and actually hiring, and all of those processes involved in each of those steps. There are workforce groups, interagency workforce groups that are looking at each of those procedures and practices and developing streamlined, getting rid of old archaic systems that don't work any longer and developing new practices for our entire state. So hopefully that will help in moving forward with a more accessible application process and getting people in the door. There are lots of questions still, but I think it's pretty clear federally, nationally, and locally, lots of things point to the direction that we need to be doing work a little bit differently than we have been doing it. And to help us do that work, all of these things have converged, and I call it the convergence that created Executive Order 1414. It's a huge order, but it adds us now to the number of states that actually have an executive order. And there are many that are developing executive orders as we speak. The latest number is about a third of the states are looking at implementation of some type of executive order currently. So I spewed out a lot of stuff on Executive Order 1414. How about some questions? Anybody have any specific questions? General questions? Okay, shoot. Or don't shoot, but give your answer or your question. Yeah.
Just a couple questions.
Sure.
As part of this program, would there be an opportunity to do training of the person? Let's say the person doesn't necessarily know all the features of the job. So we have some programs where people kind of come in to learn, but the side benefit is doing work. Is that going to be a future of this, or could be a future of this?
Very interesting question. Everybody hear the question? Okay. The executive order doesn't preclude any of this. And I actually submit that we're going to have to look at the way we do business and really evaluate if that's effective today. We're already seeing that our workforce is shrinking, and our workforce is aging, and our workforce is developing medical conditions that they didn't have when they were younger. And that's just a part of aging. So unless we do things differently, and quite frankly, we're tough on some of our positions. I mean, take the snowplow drivers, for example. That's a tough job. We require them to work 24/7 almost for long stretches of time if we have snow events. Is there another way to do that kind of work that's a little more less costly on the employee and better serve the needs of our state? I don't know. Maybe there isn't, but maybe there is. So I think the whole purpose of Executive Order 1414 is to get us to think differently and to think in a new way. If we decide that that's not going to work for us and we need to do what we do currently, so be it. But the call to action is to figure out a way to make it work for us and look at it. Don't just put it in place because it's existed and that's the way we do business and we've done it that way for the last 50 years. Is that the best way to do work today? I think that's another underlying call to action in this executive order. The training, our office, Affirmative Action Office, is developing training in a lot of different areas related to individuals with employees with disabilities. So we're hoping to roll out some specific training for managers and supervisors and employees in the next few months regarding reasonable accommodations, regarding how FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, intersects with ADA or might intersect with ADA. How do we handle that? What are our best practices and evidence-based best practices that we need to implement? So those are currently being developed and should be rolled out very soon, so pay attention to training announcements coming up soon. So if there is a greater need for some specific type of training, I'd be happy to be the recipient of that information and take it to wherever it needs to go to get that moving in the right direction. So if you have some ideas, forward them to me. You have my business card is at every place today, so you have a way to reach me. How about some other questions? Okay, in the front?
Hi, Ken Rogers, Mark Hughes.
Hey, Mark.
Glad to be part of
Yeah.
this. You know, this is really thrilling to me to see that the state has taken this step because in 2008, when the downturn in the economy, real estate, what have you, unemployment took shape, there were about 80% of the disabled population, or 78 point something, not being able to be employed.
Right.
And I think by this program that the state and the governor has implemented, I think we can get this program down to whereby if a disabled person gets promoted or moves to a different building, the manager can say, well, come on in, we've had a disabled person in this position before, here's what we can do to accommodate you, and we'll do whatever it takes to accommodate you. So we can try to eliminate a lot of the barriers and make that disabled person feel like one of the team. Because remember, when a disabled person comes into any new position, it's going to take a while for your regular team employees to, and I'm not trying to misspeak here, to get used to a disabled person being on the team, but it's also going to take a while for that disabled person getting used to being around the office or working with this team every day and the different way that we do things. That's true. But we just want to be one of the team, and we want to show up for work at 7, 8, 9 o'clock, whatever it is, and go home at 5 or 6 or 4, whatever we go, and be one of the team. And that's, in a roundabout way, that's the whole point of this whole thing. And we just want to come to work for the state of Minnesota, or in my case, private industry, wherever it is, and go to work and make a living and do just like you folks do, if I can use that for example. And I hope I didn't make Ken. But I was trying to make a point.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. You know, the interesting fact of the matter is that as human beings, we're oftentimes afraid of what we don't know, what's not in our own comfort zone. An individual with a disability is somebody outside, or could be somebody that's outside that individual's comfort zone. They don't have much experience with individuals with disabilities. So there's a hesitancy, there's a discomfort. I know just my own experience of coming to the department here, there's certainly a change of how I'm received and accepted now than when I first came. There's a lot of hesitation when I first came because I was different. But the more that people get to know me and my work, the more people don't see my disability. And I'm so much more than my disability. My disability is only a small part of what makes up me as an individual and as a worker. And I think that's what your comment really is implying, that people with individuals with disabilities are much more than their disability. That's just one piece. So we do have some work to do in terms of helping change the culture. And again, I mentioned the employee resource group, FUEL. That's our charge, is to try to help elevate the awareness and make that a little bit more comfortable for people. Because once we know something, it becomes more comfortable. What we don't know is very uncomfortable oftentimes.
I can second that. Ken and I have worked in some projects here at the state level in the past. He's one of the most talented individuals I've ever met, so your department is lucky to have him. That's a welcome.
I didn't pay him to be here.
Yeah. I just
But thank you.
Going to lunch and they pulled me in, but that's all right.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mark.
Ken has a question in the back.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Ken, for giving a summary of all these converging activities, because it does sound like there's a lot going on.
Yep.
My question is, when we talk about making it more possible to get more people with disabilities in the door at state agencies, I'm wondering if there's work or research being done to find out how to get people with disabilities to the door. Is there any barriers to employment on access to workplaces, including, transportation? Since that's our expertise area, is there any research going on about is the barriers to employment their actual being able to get to a job because of transportation infrastructure or systems? And the second question is a shorter one. With the Olmsted plan, it sounds like the focus is on state government. Is local government involved as well?
Yeah, I'm going to answer your second question first. Right now, our Olmsted plan is all about state government. The hope is that local government will be brought in at some point along the way, hopefully sooner rather than later. It was a huge move to put a sub-cabinet together with 10 state agencies to talk to each other. That's never been done before at that level. I mean, we've had state agencies talk to each other before, but not at that number and not at this extent. So I think we're seeing some new ground being forged, trying to break some of those silos that exist between agencies. But we don't have all of the agencies that we need to have at the table right now. Clearly, Met Council is not at the table, and they're hugely involved with transportation for individuals with disabilities. So there's only so much we can do as a state agency related to transportation, but we have a big impact nonetheless. So for us to be at the table to start the discussion, and I don't want to leave you with the impression that the Olmsted plan is a static plan that gets written and then we implement it and it's done. This is not the case. This is a flexible, dynamic, living plan that changes and updates constantly as the needs grow and as the needs get identified. So it's the beginning, not the end. That is a really critical point to keep in mind. So as we learn what we're missing from our Olmsted plan, what's not there, and I think that's part of the charge of the Olmsted Implementation Office, is to help identify those. Right now, they're really focused on state, looking at state legislation, looking at rules and statutes, what needs to be changed to remove those barriers. And that's an important piece that needs to be done, but it's certainly not the only piece. It's the beginning. Okay. And the first question, in terms of identifying issues, with the limited number of individuals with disabilities currently in the workforce, do we know all of the issues that we deal with all the time? Having more individuals within the pipeline and in the system will certainly bring light to issues at a different scale than they currently are. So, it's like nothing gets worked on unless it's identified first. We all know we don't have perfect systems, but let me tell you, our systems are a lot better here than they are in a lot of other places. And research, I can't answer that. I don't know. I know research is constantly an issue, but that has to be paired with resources too. So who does the research? Who's charged with doing the research? Good questions. Okay.
Another question, you said that 7% was the implementation goal, and for each of the state agency. Since it seems like our operating fund, the effect of our operating fund is going down, more and more of our work is being done by consultants or contractors. Is there part of this that is going to be incorporated into the contracting part of it, so that we get, full or 7% for the amount of work that the whole department actually does?
That's
By themselves or through others?
Yeah, good question. I know the Office of Civil Rights is working at ensuring that the people that we contract with on large-scale projects that have federal funding have to meet that mandate. So they're busily ensuring that that is the case. I would hope that that becomes a standard practice, that as we walk the talk, so to speak, that we become the model that others will emulate. That's a very lofty goal. So does that ensure that that's going to happen? No. But if we implement that and have it in place and it's successful, and we're having success at it, and visually it makes a difference, because our employment picture needs to mirror the picture of the people we serve. That's why these rules and laws get established. Executive orders get signed and implemented, is to change the way that we look so that we don't look different than the people we serve. And that's a key piece that I want to make sure that you all hear that. It's not that people with disabilities, in this instance, are the end-all, beat-all employment prize. It's that we serve people with disabilities, so we should have people with disabilities within our workforce. They bring a different perspective to the table. And when we're looking at new ways of doing business, creative ways to problem solve, we need, the more diverse people we have at the table, the better suited we are to meet those problems head on. So it's not a guarantee, but it's a way to really improve the way we do business and the potential that we have at developing the way we work. Does that answer your help? Hi, Nancy.
Thanks for an outstanding presentation.
Sure.
What campaign do you have for outreach or recruitment that will provide this means to attract the candidates that you wish to apply to our system?
Great question. And we do have several statewide endeavors going on right now. One is an organization that actually MnDOT started, I think it was maybe 10 years ago. You can help me fill in the details, Lynn, if that's not correct, but about 10 years ago, the DOT started a collaboration with community agencies within the area that serve diverse populations. And in working in collaboration with those agencies, we've developed connections and pipelines of diverse individuals to apply for some of our positions. That program still is thriving. It's now actually spearheaded by dual Department of Transportation and Minnesota Management and Budget. And we've now expanded the membership of that organization into other state agencies as well. So other agencies come to the table. Community resource agencies are at the table, and we share information and create a pipeline with each other. So that has helped create a diverse applicant pool, a much more diverse applicant pool than we had in the past. The same is being looked at in terms of organizations with disabilities. Networking, collaborating, trying to do more. One of our state agencies, Department of Employment and Economic Development, houses vocational rehabilitation. They have, I believe the number is 30,000 individuals with disabilities looking for employment. What better pipeline could we need than vocational rehabilitation? So we just need to communicate better and get aligned with how to use that effectively, how to use that as a tool. And that's being looked at. That's being actively looked at with this new executive order. So thank you. Now, that's probably not enough, and we can do more. So if you have any ideas or thoughts, shoot them to me and I'll send them to where they need to go to be moved up the chain. Okay, it's 1:05. Wow, this hour flew. Okay, well, thank you very much. If you have any questions, you know where to reach me. Thanks for coming.